So essentially, the abundance agenda is about housing and the housing crisis. It is about environmentalism, and it is about regulatory constraints that prevent the building of green projects, including green housing projects. The solution has to do with economic freedom, political liberty, the power of ideas, and independence. Hello, and thank you for joining me today. This is Mark Shupe, host of the Moneyball Method podcast. I am the author of the book, The Moneyball Method, a Middle-Class Manifesto for Objective Investing. And typically we talk about things related to personal finance or economics, and sometimes current events and social movements. And that's what I would like to talk about with you today. There is a new movement within, all globally, I suppose, called the abundance agenda. And the abundance agenda is a fairly new phenomenon, both politically and economically. The abundance agenda is the notion that government can and should do more vis-a-vis public and private building projects, both home building and infrastructure building, especially green projects. But in order to do that, the cumbersome leviathan of liberal regulations needs to be pared down considerably. And that's where the trouble starts. Bright blue progressives don't like that part. So essentially, the abundance agenda is about housing and the housing crisis. It is about environmentalism, and it is about regulatory constraints that prevent the building of green projects, including green housing projects. Supporting the abundance agenda is a New York Times best-selling book titled Abundance, written by Ezra, Klein, and Derek Thompson. Ezra Klein is an opinion columnist of the New York Times, and Derek Thompson is a staff writer at Atlantic. And I am in the process of analyzing this book and writing a series of Substack articles that evaluate the premises, the fallacies, the facts, and the overall political and economic impact that the abundance agenda might have. These Substack articles go chapter by chapter, beginning with the introduction to the book. And I would like to read a paragraph from my Substack article that is focused on the introduction. For me, reading it recalled Voltaire's classic satirical novella, Candide, and the story of its utopian society of El Dorado. This is a quote from the book written by Voltaire. You probably don't have any of our currency, but you do not need any money to dine here. All the inns established to further the trade of this nation are paid for by the government. What is it? What is this country, said one to the other, which is unknown to the rest of the world, and where nature operates under laws so utterly different to ours? It is probably the land where all is well, for clearly such a place has to exist. And that is what the introduction to Klein and Thompson's book means to me. It means a description of a utopian society that defies the laws of nature. It defies the laws of economics. It defies human nature. And it's best to define what that really means. And to quote from my article regarding the introduction, it bears repeating. Economics is about cause and effect. Production creates wealth. Wealth creates demand. Supply lowers prices. Markets create information. Markets reward efficiency. Efficiency creates profit. Profit attracts capital. Capital finds talent. Talent obeys reality. So what I'd like to do next is talk about some of the good things in the introduction to abundance, particularly as they relate to economics. What are the premises of the book supported by the facts of nature, the laws of economics. The first premise of the introduction reads, regulation that pulls scientists away from their most promising work, denying millions of people the discoveries that might extend or improve their lives. That is absolutely true. The force of government regulation, particularly with regard to medical discoveries or technology, do indeed deny people the things that we just don't know because they haven't been invented yet, they haven't been discovered yet. But what that misses is something that is equally insidious, and that is taxation. That is the removal of capital that could fund the research that would lead to the discoveries that improve the lives of millions of people. So the premise is good. Regulation does that, but it misses taxation as being a partner in that crime. The second premise of economics related to the introduction is a subsidy for a good whose supply is choked is like building a ladder to try to reach the elevator that is racing ever upward. Subsidies are like taxation. They are an extraction of wealth from the economy through the use of force by government regulators and central bankers and legislatures. The third premise states that supply chains have been battered by the pandemic. Absolutely, except for one little problem. It wasn't the pandemic. Viruses do not paralyze supply networks. It is politicians who panic in the face of a pandemic that paralyzes supply networks. And this is missed by commentators of all political stripes regarding the COVID pandemic of 2020, what I call the Wuhan virus. It originated in China. This was a destruction of economic networks that were created over the course of decades that we still have not recovered from. Number four, the more growth there is, the more radically the future diverges from the past. That is absolutely true. But what impedes that growth? What is holding back from the future that is only in our imaginations, or in the imaginations, I should say, of entrepreneurs, scientists, and engineers? It is regulation and taxation. Number five, when productivity surges, what we get is not more of what we had, but what we never imagined. The only constant in this world is change. And with the pace of innovation and technological advancement being what it is, it's difficult to imagine what the future might look like 10 or 20 years from now. Think back to 20 or 25 years ago. Our lives have changed infinitely in infinite ways, such as the ability for me to do this podcast and for you to watch it anywhere in the world, whenever you like. Number six, it is not a failure of the private market to responsibly bear risk, but of the federal government to properly weigh risk. That's interesting. It is not possible for the federal government to weigh risk. They don't have any skin in the game. They are not motivated by profit incentives. Only entrepreneurs and investors who have skin in the game, meaning their own capital, their own fortunes, their own futures, who are driven by the incentives of prices, markets, and profits, are able to bear risk efficiently, rationally, effectively. It is impossible for government to do so. Number seven, we will not get more or better jobs by closing our gates to immigrants. That is absolutely true. New people, new energy, new ideas, active minds creating values always add to the economy. This comment by Klein and Thompson reminds me of a book by Julian Simon. Julian Simon's thesis was that the greatest resource, the title of his book, is in fact human ingenuity, people creating value. Sadly, Julian Simon's work is not cited by this book. But those are the top 7 economic factors that I felt were true and worthy of commenting, and then ultimately offer a solution to the homeless problem, the housing crisis, the construction and regulatory burdens that are holding us back. Now I'd like to move to the first chapter of the book. Chapter 1 is titled Grow. Grow what, you might ask? We'll get to that. But my impression of reading the book, or reading chapter 1, I should say, comes from another book that I read a few years ago, a very influential book, one that is largely unknown, but it was revolutionary. It was titled The God of the Machine by Isabel Patterson, published in 1943. To quote my article on Substack, reading it recalls Isabel Patterson's classic treatise on the builders and destroyers of modern civilized society. The God of the Machine, in particular, chapter 20, The Humanitarian with the Guillotine. To quote Isabel Patterson, if he wishes to help humanity, the whole of humanity must be in need. The humanitarian wishes to be the prime mover in the lives of others. He cannot admit either the divine or natural order by which men have the power to help themselves. The humanitarian puts himself in place of God. That is a powerful quote with a lot of meaning. Probably the one that struck a chord with me, and the one that is totally lost by the authors of Abundance, is that we all have the power to help ourselves. We are not a bunch of poor, dumb slobs who live lives of catastrophe and chaos that cannot fend for ourselves without the help of credentialed experts and government authorities. That is a false premise. That is a malevolent premise. That denies human nature. That denies our capacity for free will, for rational thought and action, for choosing our own destiny, for independence. And independence is key. Independence is the virtue that is being denied by the central planners that are trying to solve the homelessness problem, the housing crisis, and the regulatory burden, of which we're going to discuss in greater detail in my next podcast. But what are the economics of chapter 1 that are sound? Number 1, ideas and the technologies and companies and products they power draw the outer borders of growth. Yes, it is ideas. It is man's capacity for reason. It is our ability to think independently that must be protected and that must be incentivized, but not by government. Number 2, housing costs are highest in the superstar cities that now drive the economy. Yes, they are. Capital is attracted to talent. Talent is attracted to talent. People congregate in cities in order to network with each other, to compete with each other, to share ideas with each other, to build teams with each other. The demand for housing is likely to be higher when people who are attracting capital tend to congregate in the same place. This is not necessarily a problem for some government central planner to try to solve. Number 3, through bad policy and worse politics, we're doing in the 21st century what we so feared in the 19th century. We are closing the American frontier. The authors are alluding to the development of the landmass known as the contiguous 48 states, moving west, developing the frontier. But not only did we develop land and expand the country geographically, the 19th century was a time of economic freedom, of political liberty, of capitalism growing and becoming a reality organically. Nobody planned it. No one could plan it. And the same is true in the 21st century. The only frontiers are those that are limited by the ideas, that are limited by economic freedom, that are limited by political liberty or the lack thereof. Number 4, the economic frontier is where new discoveries allow for the making of new things that can be sold to ever more people. Absolutely. That is, with a growing population in particular, that is the need and virtues of growth. In order to increase our leisure time to be able to enjoy the things that make life worth living. Number 5, Eric Yuan, Zoom's CEO, explained that it's too hard to build trust without nearness. Trust is the foundation of everything. That goes back to the high cost of housing in cities where people with talent tend to congregate. But it also talks about trust being that which attracts capital, that which incentivizes ideas. And trust is something that is built over time. Trust is doing what you say you are going to do. Trust is based on mutual transactions voluntarily entered for mutual profit. In other words, trust and force are opposites. Trust and force are like oil and water. They do not mix. And the authors of Abundance lament the fact that people have lost trust in government. The regulatory state has become too large. It is extracting too much wealth from the economy. It is stopping people from building. All of that is true. But it has to work that way. The larger government grows, the less trust people are going to have in government, because government is force. Government can do nothing without the force of taxation and regulation. And there's a good reason for that. Government is set up to provide retaliatory force against those who might infringe on the rights of others. By its very nature, government is force. It is the opposite of trust. Number 6, it is the liberals, and particularly the strain of liberalism that began to develop in the 60s and 70s, that bears much of the blame. Strain of liberalism. Liberalism is actually a good thing. Liberalism is about trust, about free trade, about tolerance. The strain of liberalism that these authors are discussing is not liberalism at all. It is socialism, collectivism, statism, whatever you want to call it. Number 7, what really puts the clamps on housing supply is zoning as a form of anti-growth regulation. Now we're getting to the crux of the problem that this book is trying to solve, or it purports to try to solve. Zoning regulations, also known as not in my backyard, are an anti-growth phenomenon. They do have virtuous benefits in some cases, but they also can be used to keep people out. It is a form of collectivism. It violates individual rights, meaning the freedom of movement in the pursuit of your own rational self-interest. Zoning regulations is something we'll discuss in the next podcast. And lastly, number 8, starting in the 1970s, wages began to stagnate, inequality began to soar, inflation began to rise, and housing prices began their inexorable march upward. Also known as stagflation, an economic phenomenon that was new to Western culture, perhaps new to the world. It had never happened before. How did we have inflation while the economy was growing, not growing, or in recession? Classical economics suggests that inflation is a result of a booming economy. That was not the case here. What the book does not discuss is the monetary cause of stagflation. It can be attributed directly to President Richard Nixon's removal of the US dollar from the gold standard in 1971. Yes, this did happen in the 1970s, as the authors claim, but they do not attribute the cause. In fact, this book ignores causation. It ignores cause and effect. The book is trying to create a utopian society, create the effects that sound good to most people, while ignoring the cause of what might be necessary to put the wheels in motion to create such a society. So what I'd like to do is close my conversation with you today with 4 questions related to housing, relating to the housing crisis, the cost of construction, the high cost of mortgages, the homeless problem. These are the questions that we want to answer both on this podcast and in my Substack articles that evaluate this book. Number 1, what is the cause of homelessness? The authors argue it is housing prices. It is not. What is the cause of the housing supply shortage? The authors argue that it is construction restricting regulation. That is certainly part of the cause. But the doubling and tripling of building material prices in 2020 through 2022 were not because of the standard regulations that were on the books. They had another cause. What is the cause of the high cost of housing? In particular, mortgage rates. Mortgage payments consume an ever greater portion of a household's disposable income. Why is that? Why did mortgage rates spike so sharply between 2020 and 2024? The authors do not discuss that. I will. Number 4, what is the solution? That's the hard part. And I've already alluded to it. And I'll discuss it in greater detail in the next podcast. The solution has to do with economic freedom, political liberty, the power of ideas, and independence. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to talking with you next week.